The other question is, after successfully controlling the puck for a good 45 minutes, how the hell did Canada lose the Olympic gold hockey medal to the United States?
Don't even bring this up. I'm still pissed off. You're lucky we even had this conversation with me. I've been trying to... So let's get into it. So welcome to an episode of Increments. This one has a bit of an interesting backstory. So Vaden and I often yell at each other on our Patreon episodes about various subjects that we disagree about. But unfortunately, there's not enough daylight typically between us with respect to the political moment right now to make our disagreements there at all interesting. So we're going to bring on someone else who can hopefully puncture our bubble of libtardism and push our intuitions around and perhaps make us change our minds. So we're having a guest who will pseudonymously go by Don Robinson in the podcast for various personal and privacy reasons. So Don, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Guys, yeah, thanks very much for having me. And I definitely don't think of you as libtards at all. I've been long time listener and Patreon supporter, and really appreciate the approach that you guys bring to all kinds of topics. And this felt like a safe space to use your terminology. So happy to be here. And
we love safe spaces.
Yeah, yes. And by the way, I mean, maybe not to just jump straight into it, but this notion of anonymity and how I sort of feel like I need to approach this conversation in that way is maybe just as fascinating as anything else we might cover, because I'm sort of seeing what I observe is the kind of rhetoric used ostensibly to defend democracy actually creates this environment where a citizen feels like, hey, maybe I have to hide my identity to participate here. And, it's kind of, I think we're all familiar with like the more extreme rhetoric from the left, that sort of shifts the conversation from, we're not just disagreeing about policy, but we actually have a moral, failing. When a leader is framed not just like as a politician I agree with, but as an existential threat or uniquely evil, then any type of nuance could be perceived as being complicit. And then there's even this like sort of commonplace version that you might hear in the workplace or something where no one's wearing their Antifa armband to the conference call, but there's this sort of more commonplace subtle social shaming that kind of goes on. So it's, I was thinking about this, and it's somewhat ironic, and maybe you have some thoughts on this, but, I feel like a healthy democracy does rely on being able to have, relatively, low stakes conversations, but the reaction to Trump, has raised the stakes so high that maybe the social penalty for, even having a nuanced conversation or saying he's not that bad or God forbid, supporting him, full throatedly could result in ostracization or, professional cancellation or, you lose a job, lose a client, that kind of thing. So I thought that was an interesting, way to think about it to start.
Yeah. I'm actually curious on that note, if you feel like you would want to stay anonymous if you were arguing in the other direction. So if if you were in certain circles, and perhaps it just makes it a bit easier since Vaden and I, lean slightly more to the left these days, but you can imagine a similar conversation where like you're coming on to defend the left on like a slightly more right-leaning podcast. Do you think you'd also want to be anonymous, or do you think there's an asymmetry in like the cultural discourse about who's more ready to cancel who?
Yeah, I perceive an asymmetry. I sort of look at, the institutions like academia, like, frankly, a lot of corporate America, cities, right? If you live in a city, it's mostly going to sort of, lean left, I think, politically. And so there's, for someone who, has a professional career, lives in a city, got to interact with other families. I think there's more of a social cost to being on the right and sort of publicly, supporting or defending or having some kind of nuanced discussion about Trump. I mean, that's kind of how I feel it. Maybe you guys, you guys obviously don't have any issue with it, supporting, the other side. So, maybe there is an asymmetry there.
Yeah, it might also have to do with, your views relative to the community and the bubble that you're in. So I can imagine, if I was living in, I don't know, Texas or something, and speaking more openly about my left-wing politics in a particular community might lead to community ostracization, maybe less on Twitter or Blue Sky these days. But I'm curious, in the bubble that you find yourself in, are you more right-leaning than your friends or family, or are your friends and family kind of aligned with you on these questions, or how does that work on your side?
Yeah, I'd say families generally aligned, although there's some, it's not stark one way or another, and that it's not like I have some one uncle who sort of thinks differently than me. I'd say it's probably 50-50 in the family, but in the social circles and professionally, I think it's pretty strongly left leaning. So that's kind of the water that I'm swimming in. And it's kind of interesting. Like, I wonder how many other, folks in my position share the same view that, they almost want to react to that in a sense that you see everybody sort of saying the same thing and, all rolling their eyes in unison and all sort of talking about, whatever Ezra Klein said last week as if they came up with it. Right. To someone who's more independent minded, it can seem a little bit like sort of a weird culty echo chamber, right? Which it's kind of ironic, like both sides lob the cult accusation at each other. But it maybe it can sort of seem that way. But, I would just say maybe just to step back on that for a second. Like I'll just I think it's probably good to just get out of the way first here. My goal for this conversation is just to have a good faith discussion of whether it's political strategy, psychology, rather than just sort of reacting to our surface level controversy around Trump, because people can get that pretty much anywhere. There's some stuff that I think could be really interesting to the Increments audience, like, why Popper might even be a Trump supporter, or at least maybe not too concerned about Trump. I think there's also, sort of an interesting critique or exploration of like why the majority of the critique against Trump, though it's so vitriolic, it doesn't seem to land. I mean, it seems to, seems like Iron Man. It kind of just seems to, ping off him. And then, maybe we'll find some areas of disagreement there and kind of explore those together and, hopefully learn something and, make a good podcast episode.
Yeah, maybe just to say a bit of background for the audience. So in one of our Patreon episodes, Ben and I, but more so I, was going on a giant tirade about, I think, Jonathan Rauch's article saying that Trump is fascism. And somewhere in that episode, we had acknowledged that maybe half of our audience are Trump supporters, MAGA. Something I'm going to ask you in a bit here is which terminology you prefer. But I'll just say Trump supporter for now. And probably half the Deutsch Popper online community is Trump sympathetic as well, including Deutsch. But yeah, I think maybe just a brief statement about what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation might be valuable because, like you said, like what I don't want to do, although I likely might still do it because I'm a fallible human being, is start falling into the trap of arguing about talking points. That kind of content, there's endless hours of that on YouTube. I think there is value in that kind of content. I would just point people to Destiny as my personal recommendation for if you want to hear talking points being thrown back and forth, whatever, you can find that there. So I'm going to try my best not to fall into that trap. Please call me out on it if I do fall into that trap. But what I want to get from this conversation is just a better understanding of the mind of the Trump supporter, because it is such a paradox to me. And so I'll be probably asking questions that are more along the lines of breadth rather than depth, and certain threads that if we were more in debate mode, I might push harder on. I may just leave them for the audience to decide, especially when they're endlessly been debated already online. But yeah, so just kind of a statement up front about what I'm hoping to get from this conversation and where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that sounds great, Baden. Although I might pick a slight bone with the pathologization of Trump support, as a sort of a mental disorder needing examination, right? That's hopefully that's we're not thinking about it that way. And but just for context for everybody, like I definitely consider myself right of the current center. But also somewhat weirdly progressive in the sense of being very dissatisfied with like status quo politics and maybe everything, sort of how I see humanity's failure to progress, as of late. I will just say I'm not a like revolutionist. I think we're going to have an interesting conversation about how incrementalism actually needs to be here as well. And then the last thing, if you really can't stand what I'm saying, just keep this in mind. At least I'm not a Bayesian epistemologist.
Thank God for that. Yeah.
That would be the lowest of the low. Yeah.
Could be worse.
I was actually going to maybe start by just getting a sense of how you view the current political landscape. So, I mean, I said a bit tongue in cheek earlier that Vaden and I were on the left, but I don't consider that to be true. So I don't really consider myself, especially these days, to be sort of a creature of the left. And it can be hard to describe sort of where you're at politically without just going through each issue on its own and litigating it. But when it comes to like MAGA versus just Trump sympathetic versus just old school Republican versus right of center versus left and leftism, et cetera. I'm curious how you'd sort of just break down the current political landscape and then maybe situate yourself on it just for the benefit of both us and our listeners. So we know, both what term to label you with, but also just to give us a sense of how you view things.
Sure. I actually struggle with this myself because it's hard to find people, who sort of publicly agree with me with sort of the level of nuance and hopefully intellectual rigor that I'm trying to bring things. Was one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you two about this because I've listened to most of your episodes and I could just you guys are really consistent with that and I'm hoping to kind of bring that here too. I asked Gemini I typed in a bunch of things that I believe and I asked Gemini to tell me what I am. And it said I was a progressive libertarian accelerationist. Okay. It described that as saying, okay, preference for higher velocity, trial and error, removing barriers as opposed to creating programs, direct accountability versus, politeness. Chaos and friction as necessary for growth. So, I'm certainly not an expert on like the broader political landscape and sort of where things are headed in that sense. But I felt like that was a fairly good assessment of me. And the core thesis that I came up with is it's almost not it almost starts not political at all. I mean I'm compared to when I was, in my late teens, early 20s, and looking fast forwarding to today, I just look around and I see things don't seem like they've really changed as much as I would have expected. It's not just that we don't have the flying cars. It's that, we still, as I get older, it seems like we're still stuck in high school. The same kind of peer pressure and need for consensus and sort of approval seeking kind of mentality that I saw holding me back when I was a kid still seems quite pervasive. And this manifests in the established order, which is yes, I'll probably be more critical of the left. Bureaucracy, but it exists on the right too. There's this kind of established, political governmental machine that's sort of, to me, seems to be steadily tending towards this like unaccountable, stagnating force that I like to call soft authoritarianism, where we kind of prioritize process and decorum and, community input over results. And, having read The Beginning of Infinity several years ago, it's sort of, white pilled or red pilled or some kind of pilled me into, understanding that, that where we currently are is not the best of all possible worlds. And, think everything can improve. And so, kind of bringing this into, into a discussion on Trump, my view here is like, despite what you might think of the guy, from my view, I see somebody operating with actually just the right amount of chaos to be a more decisive and experimental force that's required to break this gridlock and actually drive progress. And, while he's certainly, commonly perceived as being this destructive force, I think the net effect is actually closer to the kind of incrementalism that we should want if we want to see more progress in our lifetimes. There's also this other factor where, I think our institutions of, particularly the media, NGOs, academia, they tend to, continually amplify criticism of Trump to the degree that the perception of his actions, I think, is greatly exaggerated. So that's a pretty good summary, I think, and maybe a good spot to pause and get your thoughts on.
Yeah. So let's make sure I'm understanding correctly. So progressive, libertarian, accelerationist. I like that. Okay. And the main appeal from your perspective of Trump is that he's essentially breaking down all this accreted bureaucracy that had been slowing down the United States' progress. And the bureaucratic bloat was so severe that it needed someone with his kind of chaos and, let's say, lack of conventionalism, his breaking and flouting of norms, in order to kind of shake up Washington, to kind of start putting faces and identifiable names on particular actions as a means of knowing who is at blame or who is responsible, or holding particular individuals to account for changes compared to this kind of amorphous establishment where you don't really know who's making the decisions, and thus no one can really be held to account. How is that as a summary of your view?
Yeah, I'd say that's fairly close, although maybe speaking in a little more absolute terms than I prefer. Okay. But okay. Yeah, I mean, I see Trump as kind of the, some version of the boy who points out that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. By the way, this is probably my most, left aligned belief, is that, society, man, is like, dragging us all down. Like to a degree, I think that's fairly accurate. And, Trump may be, certainly not the, hero we asked for, but, maybe the hero we needed, is a good way that I think about it.
Yeah. It's funny how aligned one can be in their diagnosis of a problem, and then how misaligned they can be in how they're evaluating potential solutions to that problem. So, I'm fully with you when it comes to a lot of the stagnation that the West in particular has seen in the past. Well, some people would date it from the 1970s, other from the 90s, et cetera. And, I agree, there's lots of problems there. And those problems, many of them stem from too much bureaucracy. And, Tyler Cowen's got this line, or no, I think it's Dan Wang has this line that America is become the country of lawyers, and somewhere like China has become the country of engineers. And he, sort of uses this as a lens from which to diagnose many of America's ills, that we're just, and here America is sort of standing in for Western attitudes in general, but we're just obsessed with regulation and rule following. And, the solution to every problem is to create a committee, and then to enlarge that committee over time and ask for more money for that committee. And then, you need committees to decide on which committees need more money, et cetera. And we just, we just get totally tangled up in bureaucracy instead of sort of solving actual problems. And, to a large extent, both the Democrats and the Republicans in the U.S. have been responsible for this. I don't think there's been a single administration that has actually, decreased the overall funding for the federal government. It's just been increasing basically year upon year since the 50s or so, right? And so I agree, there's lots of problems there. And so I guess we're just going to end up disagreeing about whether Trump is an adequate solution to these to these problems. So I know that we don't want to just dive into talking points and relitigate everyone's what everyone else on the podcast circuit is discussing, but I think we need to touch a few things. So maybe it might be helpful if you had particular examples where you think Trump has done a good job.
Do you mind if I save that for one question later? Because
sure.
I just want to surface a cognitive bias on my side, and this is more related to the progressive libertarian accelerationist label. So a bias on my side that I always struggle with is assuming people have opinions that they don't have because I've implicitly just grouped them into a particular political identity. And so it would be helpful for me if I hear a bit of your reflections on MAGA. So you don't identify as MAGA, but I'd be curious to know what about the right you find problematic, because it will help me to not broadcast opinions onto you that you don't hold. And so maybe just before we start diving into policy, because we absolutely have to do that a bit, what are your thoughts on the right at the moment? And which part of the right do you take umbrage with? Which part do you not like? What criticisms of Trump do you think are valid? And if we get those on the table at the beginning, then I won't as easily fall into the trap of assuming you have certain opinions that you don't have. So maybe just a few sentences there on what problems you see with the right at the moment, so that I can be careful not to mistake opinions that you don't have for yours.
Okay, yeah, that's a reasonable question. It's sort of I'd have to give sort of I think a big multifaceted answer to answer all of it, but we'll kind of see what comes out here, but I would just say broadly, I look at the state of political discourse in the United States, and just by extension the whole world, as just one huge clusterfuck. I mean, it's so hard to nail down any one part of it. And I think what you're reacting to is maybe, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think a lot of people are frankly kind of grasping for some kind of certainty as they try to make sense of things. And I definitely was that way myself, where I sort of saw the left and the right as sort of very neatly aligned. It was almost like, it was almost like, I'm thinking of myself, back in a bar watching, President Obama's acceptance speech. I think it was one night with a bunch of other people who all kind of felt like me and acted like me. And it really felt like we were, watching, like we were in the Rebel Alliance, right? And we had just defeated the Death Star, and everything was going to be okay in the galaxy. And, and we had
and you had voted for Obama? Did you vote for Obama?
I prefer not to disclose who I voted for at any time. But I will say a huge Obama supporter. I mean, literally tear in my eye as I'm watching the acceptance speech. Full supporter. And at the time, my worldview was very much like, people sort of fit neatly into these buckets. And if you knew one of their beliefs, you could predict all of their beliefs. And there's actually sort of an interesting reason why you still might think that, but it may not actually be true, and it just comes down to preference falsification. I think that Timur Kuran has done some great work on that, and how people feel, what they say publicly about what they believe may be different than what they actually believe privately, So to sort of try to directly answer your question, how do I feel about the right now? I sort of see it as, this kind of, maybe reluctant, coalition, of many different, interests who, have sort of, banded together just by extension of the fact that we've got this, first past the post system, which I frankly agree with and think is I go with Popper on this one, that's, the superior system, of all the other ones. Would I have, would I have joined the folks, entering the Capitol building on January 6th? No, you never would have, caught me there, ever. Do I see a clip from, like a Marjorie Taylor Greene type, and am I nodding my head with her? No, I actually feel like, though, that and this is a part of what I want to talk about is that there are actually lots of, very valid reasons and frankly smart reasons why somebody might support, the GOP, the Republican Party, Trump, whatever, sort of in spite of some of the, some of the, more glaring issues. And I think, by the way, you'd probably, we don't need to go do a both sides thing here, but I would imagine you would probably feel the same about the left, broadly, right? That there's some distasteful elements. Generally, it sort of trends in the right direction that I think is best to manage a society and people. And, and I've kind of, picked my side and I'm going to sort of tend towards that side.
Cool. Yeah. I'll maybe ask some more questions, about that, as the conversation proceeds, but maybe we've withheld the ball for too long. So Ben, I know I interrupted you earlier. So
no, yeah, I was just wondering if you had, I guess, any examples, if any stark examples come to mind of where Trump has really helped reduce the bureaucracy or grease the wheels of progress in your view. Can we point to specific policy wins there where you're like, okay, this is why I want him in office, and no Democrat would have done this, and this, anyone else, this basically would have been impossible, and sort of thank goodness this guy is there to do that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think illegal immigration is a really obvious one to start with. I'd also just say, kind of as an aside, that there's also the component of the vibe shift being important for sort of future progress as well, which we could talk about. But yeah, I mean, I see the Trump campaigned on stepping up enforcement of illegal immigration. Broadly speaking, the actions taken for doing that have been seemingly broadly unpopular, or less than maybe half of Americans support those actions. But they are, broadly speaking, within existing policy and making use of existing laws, which allow enforcement against illegal immigrants. I don't necessarily have a super strong bone to pick with illegal immigrants or around illegal immigration personally, but I think it's maybe Trump's strongest example of where I don't know that somebody would have been quite as anybody else would have been quite as effective in terms of number of deportations, but also going far enough as to dissuade future illegal immigration. So, you might point to President Obama as being a past president who was, maybe not equally, but sort of in the same order of magnitude in terms of deportation activity. I think I would say Trump seems like he's, probably run the table in terms of voluntary self-deportations, just as a result of the more aggressive enforcement tactics used by Trump. So hopefully that's a good example.
So what are your thoughts on just ICE's actions in Minnesota, for example? Because I think we all agree that illegal immigration is a problem. But to me, the big worry here is that there's massive mission creep happening. And asylum seekers who have received the permission to stay in the United States while their asylum case is being adjudicated are being forcibly sent to detainment facilities in neighboring states. And there's been the two, what I'll say to be executions. Maybe you'll not like that terminology, but what are your reflections on those instances in particular?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the asylum seekers, and maybe you also want to lump in the handful of American citizens with the same name as an illegal immigrant that lived in the same building or something that got swept up in that as well. I think there's sort of two different things going on there. Firstly, the what I'll just call administrative errors. I think the error rate is actually quite low. If you look at the total number of deportations, I think it's it's not quite 1 million, but 600 or 800,000 or something deportations. I think there's maybe a few hundred where it was where they got the wrong person, and then that person was eventually sent home. I think that's sort of a reasonable error rate in terms of the asylum seekers. My understanding there, and not a legal expert, but my understanding there is that maybe the asylum seeking process itself was not lawful, or at least not in the spirit of the law, and that the methods used, regardless of status, so the expedited removals, the sort of advancing of background checks, that broadly speaking, due process is being used with those folks too. I would say, again, keep in mind that the context that this is happening in is one where you have, the previous administration had, up until a miraculous change of heart during the election, was, letting in, more and more and more illegal immigrants, measured, I think, by number of border crossings, but there's lots of different ways to measure it. But and that didn't seem like they were going to stop that, or maybe would start again, had they won the election in 2024, and so and maybe still will if Democrats win in 2028 or future elections. And so the sort of style of the approach, the almost frankly fearsome tactics deployed by ICE are sort of part of the solution, because you want to be able to dissuade that same illegal immigration in the future, and because you think the other party is just going to look the other way when it's their turn to be in power. So that's how I think about those, and we could talk about the killings separately as well, but I'll just let you react to that.
Yeah, so a lot of that doesn't land for me. I'll maybe say my little piece, let you respond, and then we'll leave that thread there. So CBS, run by Barry Weiss now, just did a report. Largely Trump sympathetic news organization that said that less than 14% of those arrested by ICE during the first year had violent criminal records. So if they're just targeting illegal violent criminals, they're 86% of them are wrong. So that seems like it's more than just a administrative error, I would say. Also, just a couple more points. Also, like Minnesota is on the north border, not the south. And so it strikes me as this is a political tactic to try to target swing states. It would be strange to be focused so much on Venezuelan migrants and stuff, and then focus on Minnesota. And then third, if it was just about illegal violent criminals, then it seems so weird that Trump would also, for example, change the H-1B visa policy to now be $1 million a pop. And so I take all of these news events and I start to see signs of isolationism, signs of radical xenophobia, signs of anyone who doesn't look like us shouldn't come here. And it strikes me as much more than just the careful targeting of illegal immigrants. And so I put that to you to react, and then we can maybe pivot off of this particular policy issue. But taken in totality, seeing all these news events, it seems like it's much more in line with a xenophobic agenda than it is about targeted removal of illegal immigrants.
Well, I would say you just did something there where you actually changed the conversation. We were talking about illegal immigration, and then you switched to talking about violent criminal immigrants, which is a subset of illegal immigrants. If you're an immigrant, not yet a citizen, and you commit a violent crime, that's going to be cause for removal. In most cases, it'll be a crime of moral turpitude or some other kind of level of crime that gives the state grounds to deport you. But that is, and I agree with you that is the messaging used by the administration to drum up support for broadly for mass deportations. However, the problem that the Trump administration is actually trying to solve is illegal immigration. Period. So that is, were you allowed to come in when you came in? Did you sneak across the border, or, did you kind of follow the process? So those, those statistics that you quoted don't really apply. My understanding is that the vast, huge majority of this number, like 99 point something percent are folks who came illegally, overstayed a visa, some other issue with their immigration status. And I would just say we have immigration status for a reason. People have a right to they do have the right to determine their what their country looks like. Hey, quick aside here. I realized in hindsight this was a bad choice of words, but when I say what their country looks like, I mean in terms of the behavior, skills, culture of the people, which are all independent factors from their appearance or race. The people of Switzerland, for example, looks like they're ready to vote to cap the number of total people in Switzerland at 10 million or something like that. They're fully entitled to do that. And there's no, protest groups, stopping traffic across the Golden Gate Bridge, trying to, railing against Switzerland, right? So I think this is actually we could debate the merits of it, certainly. But I think it's within the rights of a people to set their own immigration policy. And I think a lot of people on the right, and Trump supporters would be, would be happy to see fewer, illegal immigrants, period, regardless of criminal status. You brought up a couple other points, Vaden, just so that I get a chance to respond to everything. Of course. You mentioned the north border state of Minnesota being a potential political tactic against swing states. You're probably right about that. I don't really have I don't see. I've also wondered, why Minnesota? Why not a state with more illegal immigrants or something like that? So I think you're probably right about that. The H-1B visa policy you mentioned, charging $1 million a pop, I see this as a revenue generation scheme and also potentially a quality, a filter, for immigration. I do, personally, I would say I'm in support of people wanting to immigrate here legally. I'm, in support of being selective about who's let in. I think, anybody who's suddenly found themselves in a social situation or a part of the city where, for whatever reason they felt uncomfortable, can understand the fact that, there is a benefit to having, don't take this the wrong way, but, sort of higher quality, citizenry. And to the degree that there is, racism or xenophobia, at the root of all this, I just think that's, I'm not claiming that racists don't exist. I'm not claiming that xenophobes don't exist. Sure, they're out there, but I would guess that most people have a more, rational, sensible reason for wanting what they would call a sane immigration policy.
So you distinguish between, violent, immigrants who are here legally and illegal immigrants who are here non-violently. That was an important distinction from your perspective.
Well, no, you distinguished, right? I was just saying all illegal immigrants.
Yeah. So I kind of moved between them because Trump would move between them. For instance, when he talked about Tren de Aragua, and when he's talking about like the Haitians who are eating cats and stuff, this is, I think, trying to get at violent offenders. Compare that to illegal immigrants who are working on farms or working in construction or here illegally, yes. And in a perfect world, there would be more money put to like immigration courts and all this. But But stepping slightly outside of Trump's policies, what is the big issue with nonviolent illegal immigrants who are working at jobs that most Americans don't want to work anyway? Because I would fully be on board with Trump targeting violent criminals. If they're illegal, then they should maybe even be prioritized. But the nonviolent ones, the ones who are propping up certain economic sectors that most Americans don't want to work anyway, I guess I'm just curious why that's a big concern from your perspective.
Yeah, I told you we would have a valid debate about this, and this is certainly it. And I'm certainly open to your perspective being valid on that. Although, it does seem that, and I have heard the, Americans don't want to do the jobs line before. And to me, it always seems to sort of, smuggle in an assumption there, because, somebody used to do those jobs. And it was, for the in large part, it was, teenagers and, poor Americans. Right. I remember, my friends in high school working on a landscaping crew. Right. Right. And it sounded like a lot of fun, and, but there weren't, it wasn't them and, 17 guys from Guatemala, it was, so I don't necessarily know that that's true, right? That Americans don't want to do these jobs. I think Americans broadly in general value work, and they value independence afforded to them by a paycheck and earning one. A lot of people have they revile at the idea of being given a handout, and they actually want to go and work themselves. So I would just have a quibble with that part of your statement. And then, the other piece is that, there is, you might react, and listeners might react to this and just say, well, that's racism. But there is value in culture and in being around people who are like you. And I don't think that's a totally crazy point to make. If anybody listening to this looks at their friend group, they would probably see a group of people they like spending time with that are very similar to them. And if you're honest with yourself, I've heard this said. I forget who said it. Somebody on a podcast I was listening to just made this sort of casual statement that, like, if you define racism as being sort of, not being open-minded to spending time with, literally any group of people who, suddenly move to your town, then everybody's a little bit racist. I don't want to go, I'm certainly not advocating, going full, Nick Fuentes on this, whatsoever. But, people do like to have a culture and have a sense that the culture that they live in is going to be similar and have some continuity from one year to the next. And, there's a lot of cities in the United States now where you can go and it just doesn't feel that way. So, a final aside here, just to say, you could look at this from the perspective of any other country, and it would frankly look absurd. Like, say, for example, a French political party had aligned itself with the idea that they should just look the other way while a cohort of Americans, equal to 10% of the working population of France, snuck into France without permission. That would be nuts. I also don't think it's a crazy argument to say that would change the character of Paris, or point out that those people would be competing for French jobs or housing. I'm not trying to, evade your question at all, but I think that's the root of it. And that's why, by the way, this is one of Trump's most popular, campaign, promises, and one that he's, gone to great lengths to fulfill.
I'm curious, Don, is your view of ICE and Border Patrol more generally positive overall, or is it simply that it's better than whatever the Democrats were offering as an alternative? Because when I look at the organization, I basically see something that has been, grossly expanded in a very short amount of time. which has been handled very poorly in terms of staffing and hiring. So I think it's fairly hard to deny at this point that there's a lot of ICE agents wandering around who are not as well trained as one would like.
They're not sending the best.
Yeah, and they're not sending their best. Yeah, and that's extremely dangerous when you have people walking around with guns, and interfacing with people in public, with lots of people in public. You want very well trained officers, and we've seen some of the deadly consequences of that. And I see an administration who is purposefully bloating the size of this organization very quickly, sort of knowing full well what the consequences are likely to be, and not at all ready to take responsibility for it, which maybe brings us slightly closer to a Popperian point, whose first instinct as soon as something goes wrong is to just lie about it, is to lie both about what happened in the situation and the victim of the situation, and lie about what the victims were doing there, etc. So what I don't want to dispute is that there's a value in cracking down on illegal immigration. As you say, we have laws for a reason, and culture is important. And I think it was obviously an incredibly bad policy decision on the Democratic side to let in huge numbers of illegal immigrants. I think we probably have a disagreement there about to what extent that was purposeful. This is like a talking point that I find comes up between me and my Trump sympathetic friends quite often, is they basically take the view that the Democratic Party was doing this on purpose for many years, essentially to inflate the number of people who are gonna vote for them. Whereas I view it much more as like a policy mistake, and half of it just being like bottom up from the culture of this of harsh immigration enforcement not being popular. So anyway, that was a long spiel, but.
Just one tiny factoid to add before, Don, you jump in, which is that it is a documented fact that there was a bill that the Biden administration put forth, I think in 2023, when they themselves recognized it was the border crossings was becoming a huge issue. And that bill was killed by the Republicans because they wanted to use it as a campaign issue. And so listeners can look this up. But I just want to add that detail, that if there was any intentionality on one side or the other that was trying to inflate these numbers, that was coming from the right. But sorry, Don, please respond to both of those.
No, yeah, Vaden, and as I stated earlier, this has been a feature of both establishment parties for a very long time, right? If you look at the sort of graph, plotted number of illegal immigrants in the United States over time, it just sort of steadily creeps up to, wherever we are now, 20 million or minus a couple million.
Wasn't there a phase transition like in the 20?
Let's just say, broadly the trend has been up, and so I don't hear any assurances, that that's not going to happen again in the future. I hear a lot of people making the same arguments you're making of saying, well, isn't it great, that so many people can have an opportunity to come to the United States, and we want them to come here legally, but we want to make the legal process even easier. So essentially, seeming to agree with the right perspective, but then smuggling in this idea that actually we want to change the laws so that when you follow the law, actually you could just come in as much as you like. So I still hear that as somewhat of a popular statement, and I see no reason that a future leader wouldn't maybe try to lean into that. By the way, as a problem we haven't solved is population growth or decline in the United States, and the potential financial ramifications of that, and so forth. So maybe a side issue, but then you had asked you brought up a couple of interesting points. I think around the first was around this blame thing. One of the points that I had made was that or was going to make was that Trump's a good leader because he's ultimately accountable for the policy decisions, and you want some accountability from a Popperian sense. This is different than what the leader says, though. There's no question who is accountable and who's responsible for the increase in ICE enforcement activity. I mean, Trump is, fully owns it. Now, if we're talking about a, negative side effect of that, which we can, get into now, we said we would. I think 2 people were, killed by ICE agents in Minneapolis.
Minnesota?
Minnesota. I frankly view these as fuck around and find out type incidents. There's a couple elements to that. The first is you rightly mentioned that this size of the ICE organization has grown very rapidly, and there's a bunch of poorly trained people running around breaking things. I would say that this is true of any rapidly growing organization, possibly the company that you work at. And like to some degree, there has to be some allowance for error when trying to solve a bigger problem. In this case, scale up enforcement of immigration in a time frame that works within the 4-year election and every 2-year election feedback loop. Essentially, if you grant that illegal immigration is an issue and we need to do something about it before the midterms, then there were no other options, available, right? Due process requirements, it might take 2 or 3 years, right? And we just don't have the people to staff all that. There aren't enough judges to actually get everybody through. In that, it makes decreasing the number actually impossible. So, I think of Trump's strategy here as a necessary and decisive override of almost a dead zone, right? There's these things that happen within democratic societies that I call dead zones, where you have sort of these low point on the sort of landscape where, problems tend to accumulate. Another example would be like homeless encampments in a lot of cities. Technically they're not breaking the law from being there. We can't really move them. They have rights, and the end result is, entire city blocks and neighborhoods become, overrun with homeless encampments. And nobody would say that was better than, what was there before, and nobody would claim that it was better for the people living there. Right. But we become sort of, paralyzed in these areas. And I think illegal immigration is similar to that, because you have, on one hand, the ability to, it costs very little to let an illegal immigrant into the country. It's very expensive to and time consuming to remove them. And so, I see the issues with ICE as unfortunate. I'm not a broad supporter of ICE. I don't love to see that kind of stuff, but I do recognize that's kind of the point. Because you want to not only, remove the illegal immigrants that you can, if you agree that that's a problem, you also want to dissuade future, illegal, immigration. Just a last point, because I know we've sort of glossed over the death of 2 American, citizens. I think we will, I hope there's a good, investigation and court case, and, we get a fairly good picture of what happened in both of those situations. I know you might want to say, well, we saw the video. What you don't see is, from the perspective of the officer who may frankly very legitimately believe that his life is in danger, that there's a gun, somebody yelled gun, maybe they did grab it. It was 1 second before, right? There's a middle of a scuffle. This is the same guy that kicked our SUV last week, right? Some other factors involved there. I wouldn't rush to judgment on it. If it turns out that, those were unlawful killings, I'd fully support that decision. And if you think training's the answer to solve that, then, great. Let's do more of that. So, a bit of a complex question you asked there, but hopefully I tackled all the parts of it okay.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm reluctant to stay on this line for too long, but there's just so much there that I want to dive into. But 2 points, and then we can pivot after these two points. So I guess I am actually, in fact, unclear why illegal immigration is that big of an issue. And I'll tell you kind of where I'm coming from, because I'd love for you to maybe clarify that a bit for me. So I think both you and I are fans of, or listeners of, Sam Harris, and also fans of Douglas Murray. And so Douglas Murray, he makes the point in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, that you had mass migration coming from North Africa in particular, going through Europe. And why this was such a huge problem is because of Islamic fundamentalism, and because of a massive incompatibility between Western European values and values of barbaric, theocratic fascism, shall we say. no disagreements whatsoever that is a huge, huge issue. But then when we talk about the United States and we talk about like the big influx of asylum seekers and refugees from South America and these countries, and you were careful to at least distinguish between, or you challenged my failure to distinguish between like violent criminals and illegal immigrants. And so I guess I would have seen the rise of asylum seekers at the border as something which potentially could create an issue in the next 20 years. And we need to nip it in the bud and make sure that we are processing these cases more quickly so that we can, in fact, find out which of those people trying to seek a better life in the United States, which of them have values that are compatible with American Western culture, and which of those seekers are not compatible with that. But I guess like what is the big problem with people coming here if they don't have the views of, say, North Africans, and if they're just, I don't know, Mexican, for example. You made the point about people like to spend time with people who are similar to them. 100% agree. I just like look at my friend group in multicultural Canada, and the people I like to spend time with, their skin color doesn't correlate at all with whether or not they have the same cultural values or interests and stuff as I do. And so maybe just like give me some examples of like what is happening in the United States due to illegal, nonviolent immigration that maybe I've missed in the news. Is it just a fear generally that we'll be losing our culture, or is it like specific instances that you can give me that I maybe just missed? But maybe make the case that illegal, nonviolent immigration is a big issue, because that part I started to lose the thread a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I, I don't necessarily want to make that case so much as just say that enough people do think it's important, such that they voted for a candidate who promised to solve that problem.
But do you not think it's important? Like, because kind of saying, well, people voted for it is a different subject than it, because people can vote for an issue that is not in fact an issue, and they can all be wrong about that. Right. So just because people think it doesn't mean it's true. Right.
But that's kind of why we have the system that we have, right? Because people can be wrong. And the way we find out whether or not they are, often is to enact a policy and look at the outcome of it. Okay.
So it's not your view that it is a problem. It's your view that other people view it as a problem, and thus we should run an experiment and find out if it is in fact a problem.
I'm saying I don't necessarily want to state a case for why it's an enormous problem. I've already pointed to some issues that I think are valid, particularly around culture, for example. I think I think it's a little bit disingenuous to conflate maybe, people in your friend group with somebody who, just got here from, insert any other country here, yesterday. And also, this is all in context of sort of a zeitgeist where, or at least, among most of the sort of, intellectuals in the United States, that, assimilation is, sort of a bad word, right? The people who come here shouldn't actually need to, assimilate like your friend group, seemingly has. We should change the police patch on our town uniform to include Arabic, script, right? Or that, it's offensive to, point out this pattern that, all the daycare scammers, happen to be from Somalia, right? There is something, something there, I think, that a lot of people are very validly, reacting to, and the reason I'm sort of hesitant in giving an answer here is like, it'd be very easy to just paint whatever I say as just being a racist. And I'm not a racist. I'm very, very comfortable, saying that. I think maybe this is just one of those issues where you're going to see it one way and I'm going to sort of see it another way. But ultimately, that's why we're going to have an infinite number of these issues in the future, hopefully, and that's why we have a system that allows for this kind of trial and error mechanism when people do feel like they have a problem and are looking for the government to solve it.
Okay, nice. And so then the other point, it's to close the loop because there's two things. The other point you made, which was about the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. Hopefully there'll be a trial, and we'll see at the end of this whether or not these were just or unjust killings. I think much more likely is that there will be no trial at all, and the masks will remain on, and that scares the hell out of me. To return back to the question of bureaucracy and sluggishness, I think both Ben and I would fully agree there's too much bureaucracy in many areas of the government. I think we're replacing it with a place where there's just no bureaucracy at all. And that is, I think, even scarier when you have Canadians crossing the border from BC, where I live, to Washington. And you can look up the news story here, and then they just get sent to some holding cell for 2 or 3 weeks, only to be released without any comment whatsoever. And so I guess I'm quite nervous about the utter lack of bureaucracy and thus lack of accountability, because so much of what bureaucracy is trying to do is make sure that we keep track of who's done what all over the place. And that is a very slow process when we have so many people working in the government. And so I guess my question to you is twofold. One, how would your mind change if there just isn't a trial with these killings at all? Because to me, that is one step away from whatever you want to call democracy that I would defend, is having a process in place to adjudicate these kinds of miscarriages of justice, shall we say. And two, are you not worried, like I am, that there may be too little bureaucracy in places where there should be a bit more now? Maybe that's a bit of a leading question, but those are maybe the two questions I'd have for you before we can pivot. So let's make this the last question on ICE and Minneapolis, and then pivot to some other stuff here. But to answer your question, if there was no trial. Okay. I mean, yes, I fully expect there to be a trial in this case, at the very least a civil, there will be a lawsuit against ICE, right, from the family of Preddy, or, remind me the name of the woman who was killed.
Renee Good.
Renee Good. That's right. The courts exist, right? I don't see them, being removed anytime soon. If I could just make another observation, Trump actually seems to be quite a fan of using the courts, to his own means. And I don't mean influencing the Supreme Court. I mean like suing people who he's in real estate disputes with, that kind of thing. So I'm not sure that we're really headed to a courtless future here. There could be some details we're not aware of that could result in there being, not enough for a criminal trial or something like that. But I wouldn't be too shocked if we're having, very sort of different interpretations of the same event. And Ben, this actually reminds me of something you mentioned on a previous episode, where you were kind of saying, hey, this guy Alex Preddy, he had a gun with him, and it seems like he was killed maybe in response to having that gun, or maybe that was a contributing part of it. And I think your view, correct me if I'm wrong, was if you think the Second Amendment is like an inherent right, then just merely having a firearm should not be used by the state to justify a killing, especially if that person didn't point the gun right at somebody. Is that a fair summation of where you were going with that, Ben?
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, in particular, I was just surprised by the reaction, or perhaps lack thereof, by a lot of people who presumably would, 1 year ago said that you hold firearms and you take firearms to protest events precisely to ensure that the state cannot there's a specific word they use for this. Do not trample on me? No. There's a specific tagline? To tread on me. To specifically make sure the state cannot tread on you. And it seems that tread on some people they have. So it was I was both dismayed by the response from the administration, but also just from sort of gun culture in general.
Yeah, I think it's a fair enough point, and I bet you could find lots of Second Amendment supporters who have taken guns with them to rallies, protests, that kind of thing. I don't know that the law necessarily gives, a sort of a blank check to anybody with a gun to actually start like interfering with the police, physically. The law also, to my understanding, it doesn't actually ask if the law enforcement officer, in this case, the ICE agent, was like right in hindsight even. But it's more about whether their actions were, reasonable, in the heat of the moment. As I said before, it's helpful to try to make some effort to see it from the agent's side here. I mean, this is somebody who's trying to effect an arrest in a very hostile kind of environment. That they can't, it would be a tough, bar to argue that they need to see a gun pointed straight at them, to act. We know, at least, one of the guys, said, hey, he's got a gun about Preddy. And, we know that, that Good, started sort of accelerating her SUV, ostensibly towards the agent or other agents. It sort of creates this immediate, frankly, unfortunate. I mean, I hated to see it, but life and death reality that necessitates a response for these agents to, they have a right to kind of go home at the end of the shift, right? To make sure that they do. So, I think, my argument, by the way, is not like this is a good thing. I love that this happened. It's that the people killed, very unfortunately and tragically, are complicit in their own deaths. And a good litmus test here, could be, let's say, Ben Vaden came to you and said, hey, I'm thinking about attending this protest. I'm really excited about it. I believe passionately, in the cause, and I'm going to bring my pistol with me. You might say, as his friend, very reasonably, well, maybe, skip the pistol on this one, because while Second Amendment gives you the right to carry it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea to bring into a situation like that.
Yeah, okay. I do have lots of responses to that, but I also sort of want to be able to just give you the last word without necessarily pushing back. And I know you've said you wanted to move on, so maybe I'll bite my tongue.
I was going to say, Don, so you had a lot of stuff you want to talk about. So do you want to take the lead in kind of narrating the next question, or where we want to pivot to?
Well, guys, this is a podcast that wouldn't exist without the work of Karl Popper, right? So, I think we had touched on a few of these sort of items previously, but I have hopefully an interesting angle here why Popper might be a Trump supporter himself, or at least maybe not too concerned about Trump. It seems to me that we could put Deutsch in the same camp as well, by the way. I'll start out just by acknowledging that, Popper expressly, was in support of piecemeal social engineering, right? And by that, he meant, small changes, reversible changes, allowing for error correction, this kind of thing, rather than sort of this, broad scale utopian, social engineering, which would be more, revolutionary reboots, of the system, that kind of thing. And I just say my main point here is that if you learn to understand the rhetoric and the persuasion techniques that Trump consistently deploys, I think you might agree that incrementalism is what we're actually getting with Trump. Maybe we won't relitigate ICE, but we'll just use it as a quick example here. Like, Trump is using existing laws, ratcheting them up, certainly, the enforcement of them. There are no, to me, don't seem to be, too many sort of revolutionary, broad, changes here. I see it. What I see is working within the existing system. I'll buy it, pushing that system to where it was designed to have limits, but, to those limits, maybe brushing up against them some point, maybe losing a few, court battles because something was, a gray area and he just interpreted, or his team interpreted it one way and the court interpreted another. But we see those things happening too, right? We see the courts, pushing back in areas, what I'm actually seeing is, within the system, Trump operating according to, with some hustle, certainly, but, like Deutsch quotes John Wheeler a lot, that our problem is to make the mistakes as fast as possible, right? So, the rapid trial and error is a feature, not a bug. And I think Popper would be okay with that.
I guess instead of diving into examples, maybe I'll just keep it high level for a moment. I would just say, an important part of trial and error is the feedback component. So it's being willing to change the policy when you see it hasn't gone well, and to acknowledge that you've made a mistake, and to thereby commit to changing it. Usually, in the case of government, to commit to obeying the institutions that are telling you that you have to change X, Y, and Z because of reasons. And I see no such attitude coming from Trump or the Trump administration in general.
The man does not respond well to criticism, shall we say.
Respond well to criticism. In terms of the utopian versus piecemeal social engineering bit, I mean, that's interesting. I actually view Trump much more on the utopian side. I actually wrote a somewhat related essay, maybe 2 years ago now, just on the fading of the constrained vision from conservatism in general, especially conservatism as practiced under Trump. The constrained vision is much more aligned with Popper's idea of piecemeal social engineering, because you're not sure what the future could or should look like. And therefore you're trying things and you're very receptive to seeing actually what happens, and then changing your mind, changing course based on the feedback you get.
If you fire the Board of Labor Statistics because they produced a report that you don't like, this is not error correction working in its pure form, shall we say?
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
That's a fair criticism, and it would be a fair criticism of what I said if I had claimed that Trump himself is a Popperian, or anyone in his administration is a Popperian. But what I mean is, but the part I think Popper would support would be the idea that once elected, an executive should take as much leeway as the system affords him to rapidly try things. And Ben, you I think you were, frankly, I think it was wrong to say that Trump is not responding to feedback here, because, God, it's the example we keep going to, but, we did see the pullback of the enforcement in Minnesota after the popular kind of distaste for that became apparent. And take something like, or even something like Doge, right? Where, they kind of came in with this cut first, ask questions later. And, a lot of people were kind of up in arms about that. And, but it did incrementally, cut, $200 billion in spend. And it did, they have reduced the size of the federal workforce by about 10%, right? Not 90%. So I think that this sort of insistence on a sort of polite, well, I agree directionally, but he's doing it the wrong way type of critique, it almost just smuggles in a sort of automatic reinforcement of the bureaucracy, and it never leads to any actual reductions, only increases.
So you say Trump is working within the confines of the system. To me, I would say that the opposite is the case. But from your perspective, what would it look like if Trump wasn't working in the confines of the system? Just so I know what the opposite is from your perspective, because that'll help me orient stuff. Because I could give examples, but I'm just curious what a world would look like where Trump was not, in fact, operating within the confines of the system.
I mean, that's fair, and I actually think this is maybe the core of, or one of the cores. Maybe this is a nuclear reactor and it's got multiple cores, and they're all sort of glowing red hot. But one of them is certainly this idea that I can't believe Trump is acting so crazy outside of the system. And then the other view is, Trump's, working within the system, and as I said before, pushing it to its, some of its limits, certainly, but not too much past that. And I think it might come down to a really interesting difference in worldview. I think maybe somebody in your position, Vaden, could, maybe ascribe, what I would consider to be, too much importance on not just the express, guardrails that are codified in laws, but also the, the implicit norms and sort of, restrictions that, society sort of imposes on itself in an unspoken way. I think, just think about any of the, murderous dictators of history, if you want to know, how bad, things could get and where the actual Overton window actually is. My view is we've had, such a I don't know if this is the right term as Sol would have used it, Ben, but the constrained, we've had such constraint on the system that I think people are used to seeing politicians act in a certain way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the full range of ways that the system should allow them to operate. So, I can, but I can easily, Vaden, answer, some examples of, what would be too far, right? If you saw an executive, use the military against, his own people to, secure power, right? Or, if you saw a leader come in and, replace, the Congress with, a bunch of cronies or, suspend, the First Amendment, things like this, I think are pretty obvious kind of bright lines.
But so I feel like all three of those things have happened.
That's
it's not
interesting.
The military, it's a paramilitary. It's ICE. ICE is going to the Olympics with some of Trump's party members, which is only something that a paramilitary would do, not something that immigration enforcement would do.
But to enforce a policy, right? To enforce an existing policy. That's why ICE exists, right? They're not deporting Americans, right? Who disagree with Trump. They're enforcing an existing policy, which, by the way, has been supported by both parties for a long time.
But you already conceded that ICE was in Minnesota probably to sway the election, right? Then it's weird that they're all the way up there, not on the southern border, if they're simply doing border enforcement. It's also weird that they're going to, let me just finish the points for a sec.
Yeah.
It's also weird that they're going to Spain to enforce immigration policy in Spain somehow. Congress being replaced by lackeys. Well, Congress is completely effete at the moment. I feel like that's already happened. And then the third one you said was the First Amendment. Well, the FCC is attacking Kimmel, attacking Colbert. None of these things are going to happen instantly, but they're all in progress. And so of the three you listed, I would just be like, check, check, check. So please come back at me on those three. But
none of those things are the same as what I mentioned, and I think is a little dishonest to kind of paint them as that. Right? I gave pretty clear, stark examples of what I meant with each of those. And by the way, you're not wrong to point out some examples of things that are, skirting it close to what's allowed by the law and what I would prefer to see a leader do. When, it's not the first time we've seen leaders of both administration or both political parties in recent years use similar leeway in those exact ways. To some extent, I kind of think hey, that's, there's going to be some of that. But I don't think that's quite the gotcha that maybe you had thought it was there, because, I'm talking, I'm essentially saying look, how, absolutely, tyrannical and horrendous dictators have acted, previously in history. To equate Trump with that seems not it's not that we're, not quite there. It's just, that's just a completely different thing. I don't see that, personally as happening, and maybe you do. And, and we're just not gonna, we're not gonna solve that, in this conversation. But, it is interesting that, maybe just as a broad note for the listeners, hey, wow, how differently can people see things?
So there's a sort of a substream of right-wing thought at the moment that says Trump overriding all these institutions and trying to bulldoze them is the correct response to this neoliberal world order, which has established itself since the end of World War II, and which now is just weak and can't handle the reins of promoting Western civilization. I guess so. It sounds like you're not sympathetic to that view. You think he is still operating and should still operate within the bounds of the law and institutions as they exist. And then we just have object level disagreements over whether he is in fact operating within those boundaries. Is that right?
No, a slightly different version of that. No laws or systems should ever not change.
Sure.
Nobody should commit ever to always and forever operating within the bounds of a system. My point is more so that, when you have a leader like Trump, and hopefully many future leaders learn to operate in this way too, and see Trump's term, especially his second one, as inspiration for how far they can take executive power. I'm not kidding, because
no.
Because what we want is to find the parts of our system that don't work. And we want to develop new parts of the system. And the ideological leaning that I have is probably, if I could be accused of being an ideologue, it's probably, along the lines of, generally speaking, reducing regulation, reducing the size of the system, or at the very least, if we need to have some parts of it, come online, let's have a clause where it's got, this particular department or system needs to go away after a certain amount of time, something along those lines. And I feel like, that the systems that develop more progress and more knowledge are those that are, tend to be freer of, whatever bureaucratic system, is there. And, it's always a tough argument to make against people on the left, because I think there is maybe a bias on the left towards seeing solutions as it being the same as programs or systems or rules. And that, we're sort of building up this never ending, stack of rules and regulations, and they'll all kind of work together. And that's how we, determine, and that's how we help people flourish, is to make sure they're protected, by this, stack of regulations. Whereas, on the right, and, maybe my view is more like, people can, maybe it's more, Soelian in the sense that I think people can figure it out. I think, it's, tends to be good when people are uncomfortable, and because it makes them, it helps them be creative. It helps them solve their own problems, as opposed to, somebody, very far away, from them, trying to solve the problem, for them. So, hopefully that gives a little more kind of color on which, on how I see it, Ben.
Let me just ask one follow-up question to clarify. I can't tell if you're saying something somewhat radical from my perspective or not. So when you say that you shouldn't operate always within the system, I would phrase that differently. And I'll see if you agree. I would just say the system shouldn't be fixed from now until forevermore. We should have ways to change the system, to change laws, to change institutions, etc. We should have some legal process by which we can accomplish that. But insofar as today there are existing laws, I think elected representatives should operate within the boundaries of those laws. And so, so would you agree with that framing of it? Or do you think there's times where you have to, just say my judgment overrides the law of the land here, and I'm going to say that this law shouldn't be on the books, and I'm going to ignore it for now, and then, the consequences be damned, sort of thing?
Well, I think you'd be hard pressed to find instances of where the law is, just being completely ignored. There's, as Popper said, I think, it's impossible to speak in a way such that you cannot be misunderstood. And the same is true of writing laws and regulations, by the way. There is always some gray area when you have any system. And then, the more pieces the system has, the more those pieces interact and create other, not only dead zones, but also opportunities. And I think you want a leader who is willing to push the limits of the system. But by the way, I feel like these conversations about Trump always get sort of anchored on, his sort of more outlandish statements, that are, viewed quite rightfully as sort of these vast overreaches. We're going to annex Greenland, right? Something like this. But if you look in practice at the effects, you'll see that they don't match anything like the original sort of anchoring, over the top statements. And that's just because they're intentional tactics to control the conversation rather than simply, impulsive behavior.
So you said we'd be hard pressed to find instances of Trump actually breaking laws or flouting the system. Did I understand that correctly? And that most of the critics are focusing on what he says and not what he's doing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, like I said, you can find some, certainly, but, broadly speaking, I think you would find that, when Trump acts, what he does typically, he will, him or presumably some member of the team will, find an opportunity, a gray area, a creative, frankly, way to make good on a campaign promise, or something that he believes, voters will respond positively to. There's probably, I'm just guessing here, but it seems reasonable to say there's probably some conversation. Can we get away with that? Is that actually legal? Yeah, well, it's technically legal, and then there's the media push around it where, this sort of, crazy statement is made. It's an anchoring technique. It's not what we're actually, going to aim for. The media loses their minds. People, sort of go crazy about it. Can you believe he said that? Now the conversation is centered on the thing. And then, something happens and sometimes that thing goes, a little bit past what the confines of the law allow. And the court steps in and says, no, you can't do that. Right. And in some cases, it actually turns out to be maybe not that bad of an idea after all, and it sort of works or it achieves the goal, that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't want to get too hung up on a claim. There are public examples of the guy breaking the law. Okay. We've seen that. But I'm talking broadly about his approach. Yeah.
Let's just maybe dive in policy level a little bit, just throw some examples at you, see your reactions. So the Emoluments clause and the crypto stuff, to me, is just a clear example of him breaking the law, and no error correction mechanism seems to be working. He can't be corrected there. He's just going to keep receiving gold bars and airplanes and special iPhones and currying favor from various industries, while making billions on the Trump coin in a way that is completely untraceable. And ironically, the whole point of Bitcoin is that you can trace the transactions, but it's produced something that is completely untraceable and opaque. So that's one example. And then maybe the other one I was curious your thoughts on are the tariffs. All of the big MAGA Trump supporters in the run-up to the election, Ben Shapiro et al., were like, okay, obviously the tariff thing is him saying something crazy and he's not actually going to do it. And then he tariffs the whole world, which is now violating the whole power of Congress to control the purse strings. And then the Supreme Court says you can't do it. Then he says, well, here's some other arcane law that allows me to just put a blanket 10% tariff, 15%, 10%, 15%, forever. So to me, those are two examples of him, one, breaking the law, and two, just there's no feedback mechanism. There's no error correction. It's just him going to continuously do it. And like the tariffs are taking money out of your pocket as an American. I'm a Canadian, so I'm not being stolen from. But the Supreme Court has dictated that it was illegal. And so how do you respond to both of those examples? Why, presumably you think I'm over dramatizing things and stuff, but just maybe connect those examples to your claims that, one, this is incrementalism in action. This is Trump's ability to be held to account, and two, that these are not examples, in fact, of Trump breaking any laws, and they are, in fact, examples of him just working within the system.
Okay, so Popperian error correction does not guarantee to hold people accountable, individuals accountable in real time. And Popper would never claim that it does. the system of error correction, which Popper supports, by the way, and has said as much, or written as much, is that the system of error correction in a government is to remove bad leaders without violence. So that system has worked on Trump once before previously. This was the 2020 election, and
whether it was violence.
Okay, and
police officers died.
Yeah, and what violence was required to remove Trump from office? None. So that's the violence.
The Capitol building. I mean, the police officers died.
Removing bad leaders without violence means means the leader doesn't stay in the White House and needs to be escorted out by the military, right? So case in point, come January 2020, there was a new president in the White House, right? So that's the system of error correction. Now, the system of error correction continues to work because you have whatever Trump does, okay, over some period of time, he is ultimately held to account for that in a popular election. Now, it may not have swayed enough people for you to think that it worked, but that's the system that we have. So I don't want to belabor that point too much, but it could be that you want retribution, and you want to see the retribution happen kind of in real time for something that you are, in many cases validly upset about. But that's not what the system promises you. And I think would Popper wish maybe that Trump behaved differently? Yeah, very possibly. But I'm just want to remind you that system still exists, still works, and Trump is going to be accountable for that because there will be another election very soon. Now, sorry, just because you threw a few things at once at me there. So 100%. The enrichment stuff that you had mentioned around crypto, really distasteful. Really don't like that. I'll say I don't have a rationalization or a justification for it. When any leader uses their position of power to personally enrich themselves, that's I really don't like that. It sounds like I haven't looked deeply into it, but it sounds like you think there's a pretty strong legal case against that. If that's the case, I would be very surprised if the next Department of Justice doesn't attempt to prosecute that. So this might be one of those wait and see situations.
And then the tariffs. Your thoughts on the tariffs?
Oh yeah. So with the tariffs, I mean, you're correct that they were found to be illegal by the Supreme Court under one method, but it wasn't so clear. At least it was arguable prior to that whether or not that was allowed to be done. And if there were a Supreme Court case that could be pointed to that said, "Hey, look, this is settled law now. This is not, you're not allowed to do this." I'd be very surprised if he did it that way. Now you're saying, okay, well now he's doing it a different way. Well, that's also legal, right? There is a law that says that you can do that, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Maybe a good analogy is if you want to plug the leaks in the system. Let's find the leaks in the system and plug them before somebody like Trump can take advantage of them. That would be a very valid thing to want to do. Where are the people that are campaigning on that type of improvement of our system? I'm not sure, but so to kind of summarize, you have some good points there, but it's not quite as maybe as clear cut. I think from my perspective. So
I'm going to say something which I think is a caricature of your view, and I'm just going to say it so that you can correct it. But what I'm kind of hearing is like you support Trump because he's making so many mistakes and so many errors that we're figuring out all of the holes in the system. Is that somewhat accurate? That like the whole thing has been such a disaster. Now I know this is not your view, but such a disaster that that we're seeing so many mistakes and stuff that it's kind of like if you put a bull in the china shop, you're going to quickly figure out which of your porcelain glasses need to be locked in steel vaults. But but is this kind of the view that he's just a wrecking ball and causing so much chaos that's why you like him? Or because I know that you gave the example of immigration, and then when I drilled into it, it kind of bottomed out with, other people thought it was a problem, and this is the system working. And then I've given some other examples of tariffs or the enrichment of himself through crypto, or the targeting of Minneapolis because it's a political swing state and it's less about immigration, but it's more about controlling the voting mechanism for 2028. And all these you've been like, yeah, okay, I don't really like that too much. So like, what has he done that you like? And if the answer is not too much, then is it just that he's causing so much error and chaos that we're stress testing the system that you didn't love in the first place?
Well, that was a bit unfair because, as you said,
and I prefaced it this by saying,
and secondly, you sort of had your pick of what exampance you wanted to bring up here,
so please, right? So please bring some examples up. That'd be great. Bring some examples up. Yeah.
I want to talk about this sort of more broadly first. Like,
sure.
The main benefit. A few of the main benefits I see of Trump being president is, maybe the big one is he shows it's possible to affect political change in a reasonable time frame. Months and not years or decades. To go back to my sort of opening statement, and I think certainly I heard some agreement from Ben. I'm not sure if Baden, if you agree, but I sort of approaching middle age and finding myself somewhat disappointed with how similar things are today from they were when I was growing up. And, there is, I think, a huge society and cultural benefit to modeling this form of decisiveness that I feel is sorely needed in society at large. I think a lot of people would actually nod at that and say, yeah, that's right. Things do seem a little stuck and there's something weird, something wrong with the vibes. I'm personally a big fan of, what I called American cavalierism and exceptionalism. Maybe you don't like that as a Canadian. But growth is a chaotic and unpredictable process in this spirit. We had the pioneering spirit of the Wild West in this country, the Industrial Revolution, which started in England, but we doubled down on, and but we've got the tech and software sector here, and Americans are really good at innovation under these conditions. There is no machine or process where you put in funding in one end and you get progress out of the other. What I tend to have to see value in, and again, I mentioned this as an ideological belief earlier, and I'm certainly willing to be challenged on it. But I think about all the great stuff that I use on a day-to-day basis. The progress we have had, and a lot of it seems to be the result of sort of just generational assholes, bending society and a business to their will, and raising money and creating things that everybody thought were dumb and wouldn't work, and I see a bit of that in maybe in Trump. You might laugh at comparing Trump to Steve Jobs or something like that, but that's kind of the spirit that I see. The second thing is, there is, in my view, immense value in this kind of emperor's clothes type, pointing to things directly to things and calling things out, like, media, systemic bias, corruption of government, going after political opponents, right, with the legal system, like we saw Trump, frankly, be the victim of first. The failures of our institutions to deliver progress. And so, in a sense, I'm not making the statement that it doesn't matter what Trump does, but I'm just saying, regardless, the vibe shift is frankly a key component for me. Now, from a policy perspective, if you're on the right, then you get to see some of your policies actually implemented somewhat strongly for a change. Right. And I understand if you don't like that, if you're on the left.
Which policies?
Let's take, for example, some of the wins we got with Doge, right? You're going to say, government funding is increasing. Okay. But it showed that it was possible to reduce some spending. It showed that it was possible to reduce the size of the federal workforce, by quite a large degree. For example, I hear about things like tax cuts. Just get very excited about that. As I mentioned, I can see the case for immigration reform, and I gave some, maybe I'm not the strongest, a proponent of that. That's not a pet policy of mine, but I can sort of see the value in it, right? And the last thing I would just want to say about that is, there is I sort of feel like being on the right, I almost feel like I'm always, punching from my back foot, or because to me, progress in terms of policy actually looks like doing less. It looks like, less faith in the system of government to solve all our problems for us. A reduction of regulations, more leeway for businesses to operate in that pioneering spirit that I mentioned. Maybe someone like you see that as dangerous, removing guardrails, going to cause a bunch of problems that are worse than the problems they're solving. That's the nature of the left-right, divide, possibly, right? It's one of those nuclear cores, at least, that I mentioned before. So I didn't come with a whole list of Trump policies, and we could maybe have a follow-up discussion about that. But, hopefully you don't see me as, evading there too. If you wanted to, bring up any individually, we could do that. But that's, that was the part for me that said, hey, I want to vote for this guy. And it was almost like, the other stuff is kind of nice to have, or, an acceptable trade-off for a check on what I saw as a never-ending kind of, march towards, sort of a sclerotic, sort of bureaucratic, a state that I was personally never going to have a say in, right? How it worked, right? I'm not a minority. I'm not part of a community group. I'm not, don't really have much sway in the system other than just to vote. To me, Trump, as I said, not the hero we asked for, but, certainly of the options available, seemed like the hero we needed.
Yeah. Well, so just maybe on the subject of bureaucracy and of, progress and innovation and the spirit of the West and the great, innovative, history of Americans. I mean, for me, whenever I'm in conversations with like libertarian types, the word bureaucracy is too broad. Like there's some regulation I think is insane and needs to get eliminated, but then other regulation I think is very important for innovation. So for examples in the first category, I think a lot of the environmental regulation that prioritized windmills and solar panels over fossil fuels, I think that was a terrible idea, and I think that we need as much energy independence as possible. I think that, there's absolutely roles for sensible environmental regulations, but I don't think there's any role for bureaucracy that slows down the development of nuclear power plants, for example. So that's one category where I'm fully on board that we need to deregulate, we need to speed up, accelerate. But then you had mentioned that there's no like pipeline to just shove money into one end and then get innovation in the other end. And I would just say, well, the venture capitalism, VCs, acceleration funds, but that's a pipeline. That's a pipeline where you put in a lot of money at the top and you're kind of gambling on a whole bunch of different companies. And then some of those companies are going to become Tesla, or I don't know if Tesla was actually government funded, become Uber, become these companies that we use every day. But that system relies on, for example, regulation of the banks so that you know that you're not going to have a financial crisis every decade. It also relies on anti-monopoly regulation that breaks up big companies that any economist will tell you monopolies are a bad thing. They stultify innovation. And it also requires a sense of long-term stability such that you could make business decisions that you can trust are going to be operating in a stable political environment. And so when you have the United States' economic policy be dependent upon the whims of the leader in the morning, then it's very difficult to have innovation there. And so I guess the wrecking ball approach that Trump is taking just does not, to me, immediately leads to innovation, because innovation requires kind of a foundational, stable economy and society that it can be taken for granted, and then you can innovate on top of that. And so I just would challenge slightly maybe the broad use of the phrase bureaucracy and regulation, because some bureaucracy and some regulation is like of the utmost importance if we want to have like Silicon Valley style innovation. And to the extent that Doge and the decimation of the government is creating instability and creating big companies that can curry favor to get their tariffs reduced, I do not see this as a good thing for the project of capitalism. And I am of the left, but I am very much center left, where I believe in mixed market capitalism. I think that you need some government regulation to break up market failures and these kinds of things. And so I guess I brain dump all that to you, respond to any parts of it you like. I won't end it in a question if you want to also pivot the conversation to something else. So.
Yeah, well, part of me wants to take the bait and nice. Go on a defense of libertarianism, which, by the way, nice. I'm not a hard libertarian here. I'd say I'd probably center right with a couple of heaping tablespoons of libertarianism mixed right in there, right? And I also didn't think I was going to get a chance to sort of paraphrase David Deutsch here, but I told you would say that you need regulation in order for capitalism to work. I think the difference there is just that I just want a little less, right? And by the way, your example of venture capitalism wouldn't work if venture capitalism was a government agency, right? Because they would be accountable in some way that private venture capital firms are not.
To clarify, I was saying it relies on regulation of the banks in order to make sure that the capital is indeed.
That's a weak argument, because by that definition, everything that involves money relies on regulation of the banks.
Let me just clarify a little bit. No, it's that. Yeah.
Well, actually, Vade and I can see. I can see this. I can see this is painful for you, but you and Bruce, you guys and Bruce did a really good job talking about libertarianism, and I don't think I can really add too much there. Sure. How about this? Why don't we go into this notion that the prevailing mode of criticism against Trump, like why it consistently fails to land? So, okay, for the last, let's call it 10 years, right? I think we've all probably noticed this pattern where criticism of Trump sort of, follows the following steps, right? So one, some issue is identified, usually in some valid way, right? I'll grant. It's hard to just invent fake problems. People generally don't go for that, but, some new issue will come to the fore. And this issue is, delivered, often by experts or by the media, as if it's going to be, a death blow. And, this latest issue will be the one that finally, brings him down. Step 3 is that it doesn't have anywhere near the intended effect. And in fact, maybe Trump gets stronger. And not only that, but the effect does not materialize, or whatever bad thing that was promised, it doesn't materialize anywhere to the degree that it was foretold. And then very quickly, the issue is completely forgotten and ignored in the future, and the process starts again. And I literally saw this morning when I looked at the New York Times and saw, that the Times, as well as the Democratic response, was basically just more of the same. Oh, he lied. Oh, he verbally attacked people in the State of the Union address. Patriotism is bad. And I'm sort of confused because, I'm critique the guy and his methods, please. I mean, that's how we make progress, right? But my main view is I think, regardless of Trump's style or approach, it has been, quite effective. And has consistently failed to cause the kind of widespread catastrophe that always seems like it's being discussed. We were supposed to be in the next Great Recession right now from tariffs, for example, and I just don't see a path for that happening. So, I mean, do you guys have any ideas as to why we seem stuck in the same kind of mode of critique, which doesn't ever seem to work?
Just to clarify slightly, so are you asking why sort of the left / anyone who sort of disagrees with Trump, why their critiques seem to bounce off him and his base and don't change that many people's minds? Or are you asking why many of the critiques are ultimately wrong and don't pan out on your view?
Well, I think it's both, right? A good critique would politically speaking achieve both of those. So, and I just noticed that it doesn't seem to happen that often.
Interesting. Okay, well, we might just have disagreements with respect to that latter one. I think just to clarify, so I think there's an interesting question to be asked about like why, from sort of the never Trumper perspective, why many of the criticisms go totally unheeded or ignored by much of his base. And I think that is an interesting question. But then I'm not sure I'd agree with you that many of the criticisms don't land or aren't true. And so I think, and so we might just have a different interpretation of of the world maybe there. So from my view, many of the criticisms do land or do turn out to be true. It's just that he's created so much chaos the next day that we stop talking about that and we talk about the next thing. But I anticipate that many history books will be written about some of the insanity from his administration and all the consequences that we couldn't talk about in the days right after the events because he proceeded to do something with 10 times the effect the next week, and then we were all distracted by that.
Well, but by this logic, though, the sort of never-ending stream of logarithmically increasing terrible things that he did would actually continue to harm him more, right? But there's the second piece to this observation, which is it doesn't actually, not only does it not seem to land or influence anybody within Trump's base, it's also just forgotten as well. It's not really, brought up again. And you could maybe argue, that, well, that's because there's so much more, but then you're sort of stuck having to account for the fact that even the more doesn't seem to have an effect. So I'm sort of curious.
But it is having a bit of an effect. The poll numbers are dropping. It is having an effect. We are seeing his numbers are close to, I think, 34%. Which is like Bush levels. And so minds change slowly, but I would maybe want to distinguish between it landing in the minds of the electorate, which it looks like it is in fact slowly starting to land, compared to the talking point cycle of the commentariat that you hear on YouTube and in the podcast circuit. So I would challenge the claim that it's not landing at the electorate level, and we'll maybe see that. But there is still a huge question of like why for the base, who will never change their mind, why does it not land for them? But yeah, so I'll just maybe quibble on some of the factual comments there.
Okay. I mean, I could see what you mean there, that really the approval rating is kind of all we have to go off of, for this. I don't know any other way to measure it other than just, at the next election. And even then, it seems like it's just going to be a referendum on Trump that the next guy is going to have to, somehow account for. So, you could be right there. I might be willing to kind of, back off that a little bit, but, I had some theories as to
Yeah,
why the base maybe is not,
that perplexes me that perplexes me to no end. And I'm really hoping you can provide some insights there. What I would want to say is that it's cult dynamics at play. I would say that about the left too, when we talk about like wokeness and stuff. I think wokeness, oppression politics, identitarian politics, exact same shit. There's the weird culty dynamics taking place. But that's not a very satisfying answer, and I feel like that leaves so much on the table still. And so I throw my hands up and say, I don't know. And please enlighten us, Don. Give us some insights. How can our critiques land better that would be an excellent insight that I could benefit a lot from. So if you have any comments.
Well, to quote the Sam Harris book on lying, I wouldn't tell you even if I knew. I will. I have some theories about it. I don't have a solution, but I have some, maybe some stuff to explore a little bit. So, like, I think a lot of the critique, it sort of takes this character of like, now aren't you mad? Right. Isn't this the thing that's finally going to sort of sway you? And, I don't know why people make different decisions. They draw parallels again to Thomas Sowell's work on knowledge. People often legitimately know things that they can't articulate themselves. And in a sense, I think a lot of the current, exasperation around Trump basically boils down to like asking why somebody hasn't gotten mad about something or another. And it's just hard to answer. Like you yourself probably have a lot of variance around this question in your daily life from day to day. I mean, one day somebody could, come up behind you and flick your ear and you'd laugh it off and be, whatever, you clown, hey, how you been? You old son of a bitch. And, another day you might turn around and punch the guy. And, I'm not sure, what sort of is the difference in threshold. I made another similar analogy to pricing, which Sowell talks a lot about, and how, prices are this way to convey, massive amounts of unarticulated information across a whole system. And, so a price like $2.99 versus $3, might be, 1 penny difference could be drastic differences in customer perception. Now, you might say, well, there's other small differences, like, say, you're buying a car for $50,300 versus $50,400. And that might not make it much of a difference, and yet a retailer can't just arbitrarily increase their prices and expect customers to continue buying, right? Everybody has a threshold. I'm not sure, everybody can necessarily articulate it. So I think when Trump's base, refuses to get mad at a specific controversy, that, you might think should be the ultimate punch to the face. They're essentially just pricing the risk. Like they see Trump's flaws as a transaction cost, and they're willing to pay that to get the product, which is, maybe this challenge to the status quo, that they want.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I think it's not just like variance and one day being flicked in the ear will piss me off a little bit and another day I won't care. Because of the hypocrisy of the whole thing. So what I'm about to say is not necessarily your view, and this is where I'm just going to generalize to MAGA in toto. But one example is how furious they were about Hunter Biden's laptop and the ideas that there was like signs of corruption because Hunter Biden sent some emails that talked about the big guy and, oh my God, Joe Biden's now profiting from his position in office. And then when the Trump corruption stuff comes around with the crypto, they're like, yeah, whatever. And so the why aren't you mad is why aren't you consistent? Why aren't you consistent with your principles here? Another example would be the fury that I shared with cancellation and with like the woke mobs canceling somebody for saying something inarticulate. And now you have the same thing happening for, say, Jimmy Kimmel when he said something inarticulate about a killing or some news event. And then now there's threats that he's going to lose his job from the government. It's like government cancellation. And I can give another example. The other one I was going to give is escaping me for a second, but it'll come back in a bit. But that's to me the question. So like, how come just MAGA as a whole is so furious when Kamala talks about price controls for grocery prices, as if this is one step towards socialism. And then Trump comes in and he tariffs the whole world. And then everyone's like, well, the tariffs aren't actually that bad. It's like, where are the consistency? Where's how come you are so mad when the left does it? And then how come you just general MAGA, how come you then just turn a blind eye or make excuses when the right does it? That to me is what I mean when I say, why aren't you mad about this? The Second Amendment, freaking out that Obama is going to take your guns, and defending, what's that white guy, Kyle Rittenhouse, his right to carry a firearm in a BLM protest. That was like a huge thing on the right for a long time, that Kyle Rittenhouse was just operating under the Second Amendment, and he has a right to be there, and he has a right to bring a fucking like machine gun. I don't know the exact gun that he brought. And then when Alex Preddy, same situation, it's all of a sudden, well, maybe you shouldn't be a bit more like careful when you bring a gun to a protest. And that's what I mean when I say, why aren't you mad? It's why aren't you consistent? Why aren't you, like Ben and I try to do, able to hold both the left and the right to account when they violate certain principles independent of your tribal allegiance? That's what I mean when I ask, why aren't you mad?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that would be a world I would like to live in too. To be honest with you, I mean, I should point out that Vaden, with the both sidism that you just engaged in, you're almost making my point for me in that Trump really is just like other politicians, who have done a lot of these things too. So, you want to clarify?
Yeah, just want to clarify. So when I hear both sidesism, I think. Somebody brings up a Biden critique, and then I immediately throw out a Trump critique. What I was doing was not that. I was saying the left is insane, and both sides are the problem. Not my side is not the problem because of the other side.
Yes, I was making the point that is the same system that Trump is operating within too. Right. So he's not so much violating norms in that case as simply more of the same from what we can expect with politicians. So either he's a destructive force that's totally overthrowing and dismantling democracy, or he's just as bad as the other guy, and you should be mad at both of them. So that's that to me seemed like maybe it was a conflict.
Maybe we're slightly talking past each other, but I'll just try one more time to clarify, and then maybe I'm missing your point. Just to use one example of the corruption. So if there's a little bit of corruption on the Biden side, I would just say that's the problem. Fucking stop doing that, please. Then the right, Trump has $1 billion worth of corruption, and that's much worse. And so my comments earlier were trying to address your question, which is that when I say to the Trump supporter, you had just finished telling me that Biden was a problem for corruption, and now why aren't you mad about Trump? That's what I mean, is why aren't you being consistent with your critiques? And then your return was that I was being both sidesist, but I'm trying to articulate that I will call out both the left and the right when they violate certain principles of mine, but the MAGA base does not seem to do that. They seem to make evasive.
Understood.
So
understood. I think you're right about that. I mean, there's a larger sort of, the politics game everybody plays where you score points and you lose points, and, to admit any kind of fault with your side is a failing of your argument, or it's it means you have to admit defeat in some sense. I hope I haven't, brought that kind of energy to the conversation. Do I have theories as to why that is? I mean, I think I just sort of, elucidated one of them. I'm not sure. But then go ahead.
I was going to say, because the subject of this last little section is like, how come critiques of Trump don't land to their base, right? And maybe one answer to that is that, like, if you were to call me out on something I said that was contradictory or hypocritical, I would immediately be like, oh, okay, hold on, wait, you're right, and I got to think about that. And hopefully there's evidence of that, of me course correcting when Ben calls me out repeatedly for various things that I've contradicted myself on. But I don't know how to make critiques land to an audience of people who don't have that mental heuristic in mind. And that's the thing I would love for you to help me get around. If I can't point out that someone is not being consistent, if that doesn't work, then how do we get through to such people? That's the question I'm begging for an answer for, because it would help.
I have a theory about it, and we mentioned preference falsification a while back, and it might be related to that, and it could also be related to the notion that I introduced earlier about people's inability to articulate expressly their beliefs or reasons even for making any decisions. And I think it's a lot to ask for everybody to be consistent. I think if we had the ability to look into people's minds, we probably could find some sort of consistency at base. I'd be surprised if it had to do really with the issues that are commonly discussed. I'd probably be looking for some kind of explanation where people have this sort of what I call the evil bumpkin theory of Trump support. You're either a Nazi or you're illiterate, and those are the only reasons you could have for wanting to, support this guy. But that just assumes, negative or immoral motivations. I think, I think there's a lot of valid reasons people would have for continuing to support their candidate, regardless of how many or other issues, go in one way or another. Just the very idea of striking back at the establishment. We talked about Star Wars, earlier, the ability to deliver a nuclear torpedo into the Death Star maybe once in a while it's a really good feeling. People really like that. And let's not just ignore the genuine material failures of government, over the last 50 years, right? I'm not anti-government. I'm not that kind of libertarian. I don't even call myself a libertarian. Remember, Gemini called me that. But people, they could tell the vibes have been off, right? They went through the whole 2018, 16, whatever cancel culture period, it goes back to why I'm speaking to you anonymously today, right? We've kind of reached this point where the rhetoric is just so totalizing that, simply offering a nuanced view is treated as this moral heresy rather than, some kind of political opinion, which it is. There's an actual yard sign that says we no longer have a difference of opinion. We have a difference in morality. I've seen that one before. And I'm not hiding, my identity here because my ideas are dangerous. I'm hiding them because the reaction is so intolerant that, privacy is the only way to have an honest conversation. So, I see somebody like Trump come along and he embodies a sort of spirit of, resistance. And gosh, I mean, I admit I sound a little bit like the left-wing activist now that I don't like, but, I feel a spirit or a chance to kind of resist against, what I feel is, frankly, I'm doing quite well. But this is the limiting factor in my life, right? This is the thing I constantly have to watch out for is what do I say? What policies do I support? Do I ever get to see my preferred policies enacted ever? Or does it always have to go to some community review board? And, does it, this really does, I think, get to the core of it, Vaden, which is, people price in all the bad stuff along with the good. Sometimes the good stuff, to them, to me, is really important. And maybe it's more important than any individual policy. And look, maybe there's a policy in the future that comes along that impacts me really strongly and directly. And suddenly that's what, that causes me to feel the pain to want to switch over. It's happened before. So yeah, I wish I could, peer into the mind of MAGA for you and answer that. But I think you might get a lot of different answers. But I would be surprised if they weren't, of that kind of character. Totally.
Maybe just a final question to wind down. Is there anything that you wish we talked about that we didn't, or any place where you felt like we were misunderstanding your arguments that you'd like to kind of correct? Just want to make sure that the last couple of minutes are free to any direction you want to go.
No, yeah, thank you, Vaden. I appreciate that, and Ben as well for having me on. This has been great. I guess two questions. So the first would be, how incremental is too incremental?
How incremental is too incremental? I think it depends on the impact of the change that you're trying to make. So if you are a small startup, then I think you got to move fast and you got to break things. But if you are talking about the U.S. Constitution, I think treating it like putting a nuclear bomb in the center of the Death Star is probably not incremental enough. So I think it entirely depends on the consequences of the decisions that you're making. And if the consequences are severe, then we need to be more incremental. And if they're less severe, then I think we need to be less. But it would have to be a case by case thing.
Can I just sort of have a chance to defend myself from that absurd statement that you made? Never did I claim to want to blow up the Constitution with any type of bomb. And that was an analogy that I was making previously. But okay. And the other question is, after successfully controlling the puck for a good 45 minutes, how the hell did Canada lose the Olympic gold hockey medal to the United States?
Don't even bring this up. I'm still pissed off. You're lucky we even had this conversation with me. I've been trying to avoid all the Americans in my life, so you're lucky. You're the first one I've spoken to since that fateful Sunday. Oh my God. Outshot you almost 2-1, and somehow you still win.
Our goalie had the game of his life, man.
Oh man. Yeah. And then Cash Patel chugging beers with the boys in the locker room after that just rubbed salt in the wounds. Like, oh man, reminded me of all the political problems as well. Like,
that's it. Yeah. American cavalierism, baby. There it is at its finest.
Can't handle it.
Well, thanks so much, Don. This was fantastic. I hope to have many more of these kinds of conversations with people who disagree with us. So thank you so much for coming on. Learned a lot from the conversation. And this was great.
An open invite to come back whenever.
Oh, thank you so much. And really, thank you guys both so much for being such gracious hosts. And I learned a lot here too. And let's keep it going.